some of you have experience, so we were really interested in that coming together of those two things, how they were conducted, who was involved, and all of that. So if we could just kind of hear the story of those who did some. And Kim, maybe would you and Stephen be willing to start with your project over the summer?
Yeah, sure. So here from Cole Camp, Missouri, this summer we had an internship, youth vocational exploration internship is what we called it. So we had 5 youth for the month of June were working with me on vocation. And so and we paid them, which held them a little bit more accountable. And the goal for me was to have them have this understanding of vocation and think about it for their lives, and for them to hear stories of all ages in our congregation. So I had a list of questions that I found or curated that we met via Zoom and sometimes in person with folks and I asked these same questions. So they were hearing other people answer, and then in hopes that then in our conversations as a small group with these high school and college aged youth, they were answering them for themselves. So I found the Fund for Theological Education, and it's FTE. I don't know if that's the name or if it got changed, but they have a resource called 5 Cups of Coffee for mentoring. And so I pick and choose a few of those questions. And then I came up with just some other random questions too, so they also, because of this COVID world, I had them call on the phone members of our congregation, which they were so brave to do it they said, they're like, this makes me nervous. I don't want to do it. So it was a good learning curve for them to practice being on the phone and asking questions. And I had then prepped all of the adults who they were calling to know, like, these are the questions they're going to ask you. So hopefully, depending on people's personalities, conversations flowed more easily or not, but they all did it. So the questions I asked were, what keeps you up at night? What brings you joy? What is something you do well and enjoy doing? What brought you to the church, and why do you keep coming back? When you were younger, what did you dream you'd do with your life? How did you connect with God? How do you experience God today? Is there a time when you felt God was absent or distant? And then what have your callings looked throughout your life? So what they all too picked up on is that the fact that we had this time to listen to people that we don't normally do well. And so it was really great that even these high school and college age girls were telling me that, we listened to people of all ages and backgrounds, and they said we could find things in our story that related to their story. So it was a fun gift, and for us to be able to be present to people, whether on Zoom or in person. We met with some community members who own businesses in our town, and I asked them how they got to doing what they're doing. Like, there's a woman who has a bake shop, another woman who has a clothing boutique in town, and so we just heard their stories. So yeah, and then I made the group do a project about what we learned. And so some of them have written some things. One girl preached at our church. Somebody did a TED talk in church. So it was fruitful, and it was fun for me to hear stories that I haven't heard of people in our community, and to see the connections. Because even in our town where we're in a church that is intergenerational, they still, you kind of keep to your own demographic and age. So this was really good for them to call people in our community and talk to them.
Do others of you have questions for Kim?
Kim, was this weekend, your worship, was that an example of a story that you're talking about?
Are you talking about the windows in worship?
Yes.
Oh, yes. No, that's different.
Okay.
Well,
sort of. Well, I mean,
it's different, but I guess it could be the same. Never thought of that.
That's how I took it.
Yeah, no, Stephen did a sermon series on the windows in our church.
Okay.
And then since we were on vacation, I had one of our older members just share a reflection of the windows and her experience of worshiping it. So kind of a storytelling as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Things you want to build on from what Kim said?
just want to lift up, I'm so glad that you connected with the FTE, the Forum for Theological Exploration. They're another Lilly funded program that just has some excellent resources on young adults in particular. And actually just last week I was talking with a couple of their folks who hopefully in a few months will do a webinar for our group on engaging young adults. But they have some excellent short videos, video interviews with young adults in particular, but it could serve as a model for those of you that are looking to build on or start video ministry. They're well done, short, and really pack a lot in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they also have a series of like 1-minute ministry stories that are really about how congregations have engaged their context. That they're really interesting too, really well done. I wanted to highlight one thing about St. Paul's Project, which was that another thing that was behind the thinking of it was that there were all these young people who wouldn't have any work over the summer. And so they received a small stipend to do this work. And I think that's a really interesting contextual piece. This was a strange summer. And several of you have had a thought about that you might want to make a small stipend to the young people carrying out the interviews. Then you can expect things. You can expect things like produce something on what you learned. Like, it gives you a little hook there, but it was also a really, I think, a pastorally sensitive way of thinking about the realities of their lives over this summer. And okay, so who would like to go next with what you have done or what you're thinking about doing? So helpful for everybody else. Yeah, Erica from
yeah. So I'm happy to go. Carol, in her neighborhood, the internet is out at both her house and the church right now, so she apologizes. There she is!
Yeah. Yeah, you all have done some really creative things.
So while Carol gets settled, and I'll kind of start what project I helped work with at Plymouth, and I do want to preface by saying this feels like it happened 5 years ago. I mean, this was just in January, but it really, like, I had to go over notes and think, okay, what happened again? I don't even remember. It's a whole different world feeling. Yeah. But I think, there are some things that we learned from it, and we grew in ways we grew from this project. So what we did with some of our interviews was to put them in our Faith Ed Hour, which is kind of an adult Sunday school class. We don't have separate adult Sunday school classes. It's just we have an hour before worship. We used to have an hour before worship when we met in a space in a room. And it was about 20 adults of all ages that did Bible studies, kind of gathered for different faith-based conversations. Well, this past year, from 2019-2020 school year, we wanted to focus on the goal of listening for vocation and what that is. Our people tend to be thinkers and talkers, and not so much very generous listeners. And especially, I think Diane Millis was a big influence on us in her book, Sacred Art of Conversations of Sacred Art, and that idea of listening with the heart and what that means. So we wanted our people to learn to listen with the heart. And so in order to do that, we kind of primed the pump with a few things. One, and this is to get before the interviews, is to have people start reading stories. So we did a series on short stories and where do you hear God in the story? And so listening to authors first. And then we moved into maybe listening a little bit to your own lives, but listening to one another's lives. And that kind of is where we entered into the interviews. We wanted people to be interviewed in a group, not just for the person being interviewed to reflect on their story, but again, for our people to be trained on how to listen well and respond with good, helpful questions. So we structured this loosely at first around Diane Millis's idea of narrative circles, which is a kind of a new book. I think it was a new book that came out. she came and was a guest speaker that helped at Plymouth, and it helped us kick it off. This idea of the 4-4-4 process. You have 4 minutes where someone shares, 4 minutes of the group responding to that, sharing that shared story, and then 4 minutes of the person responding to the group's response. So it's this very in-depth, sacred conversation. So what I ended up doing was we chose speakers we were thinking of the jobs that people did. We wanted to focus on work, not just paid work, but volunteer work, what work you do in retirement, things of interest. So we chose 6 people of different backgrounds. The first was someone that's retired, but she is really into hymn writing. So we interviewed her. We interviewed someone who runs a nonprofit for it's a theater in the armed forces. So it's a foundation that brings theatrical works to Army bases. And she's also a trained actor. We brought in a man that runs George Soros's foundation. We brought in a couple that in their retirement go and do a lot of volunteering around the world. With different projects, and they're also really into racial justice ministries. We brought in someone who's a young person that's at a museum here doing a fellowship, an art fellowship. And then we brought in a local artist that kind of stumbled into our church because of the space and got more involved. And we just wanted to hear her story about how she connected her spiritual life to her artwork. So a lot of it was focused on the arts with not intentionally. I think it just kind of, those were the people who were drawn to it at the time. But the questions we asked, I reached out to Diane Millis and I said, okay, what are some good questions? And she sent me the original Lives Explored interview questions, which are like 1,000 questions. So I didn't want to, just ask people like list, because I wanted to model it in a good time frame. So what we ended up doing, I chose 2 questions that were the standard questions that we asked. The first one, and one person was dedicated to 1 hour of the class. So this took place over 6 weeks. So the question was, when you were a child, what did you dream about doing or being when you grew up? We wanted to start with kind of this playful sense of foundation, of imagination, of maybe it tells a little bit about their history of who they were. It invites people to explore that. And then the second one was tell us about the work you do now. And so these are very basic questions. And people could answer that of the work I do now is with my job, or the work I do now is with volunteering, or the work, however they wanted to define work. And then I sent them that long list and invited each guest interviewee to come in to choose the questions, choose 2 or 3 questions they were most drawn to. Again, our Diane Millis obsession, she talks about being drawn rather than driven to something. So what questions on that list do you feel drawn to? What pique your interest? What help you think of a good story? So then they would send me those questions. And so they knew what questions I was going to ask them. And I interviewed them in front of a group. So a group of maybe 20, 25 people. And I tasked the group with some homework or a job to do as they were listening. And so they got a handout that had these very simple guidelines. One is, your responses should be brief when you respond to people, 1 or 2 sentences. The focus should remain on the one telling their story. It's not your job to share your own story or opinions on their story. Do not respond based on your own curiosity. Instead, focus on what they said, not, hey, did you tell me more about this big dramatic thing I'm more interested in, rather than what was going on inside you. We wanted people to Also, know that their response should be an invitation for the storyteller to reflect and find more meaning in their story. That is the goal. The goal is not for us, but to nurture and care for the one that's telling their story. So we worked on things that you noticed, things to think about as they were listening to these stories. Where is love? Where is love absent? Where is the energy? Look at the person's eyes, their face. When do they start smiling or laughing? When do you notice tears? And you can notice what happens to you as the listener as you hear the story as well. And I was so shocked. There were times when people would tear up as someone else teared up in other stories. So as I noticed, I appreciated, I wondered. I appreciate your honesty and vulnerability. I appreciate your strength in that moment. You know, it's very affirming conversation. And then I wondered, and this is curiosity for the sake of the other. And this is an invitation for the person to explore something deeper. I wondered, you know, as you made that decision, what were some of the things going on inside you? What were some of the thoughts? What were some of the concerns you had? And so we went through 6 weeks of these types of interviews and some surprising results, at least reflecting back on them. One is our group of people that can be cynical and highly opinionated and judgmental were so compassionate and gentle with one another and caring and engaging with one another in ways that I had not seen before. And that was special. Also, a running theme that we noticed was that people were no longer so much focused on tasks, like describing, and then I did this for my job. It was more focused on relationships. The woman that talked about, or that we invited, that runs the foundation that brings theater to the armed forces, she ended up sharing a story about how her four-year-old daughter brought her back into the church. You know, that's what she chose to reflect on in calling. When we thought it was all going to be about work, it ended up being more of these tender moments in people's lives. The woman who was a hymn writer, we thought she would, I mean, she's so cerebral and super intelligent person. We thought it was going to be more about music and arts. And she ended up talking about a story and sharing a hymn that she wrote for a dying friend that was sung at her funeral. And so you see these deeper callings that happen in people's work and life that aren't so technical and task oriented, and it's not the to-do list. It's more lessons from the heart, and it was definitely we went deeper than I imagined that we would go. So it was more of a gift. The experience of it seemed to be the point rather than the results of finding necessarily. So that's what I'm sharing right now with our interviews. We kind of moved for a couple weeks into Lent with doing narrative circles with 4 people going into a small group in that straight 4-4-4 model. And it went really well. And then the pandemic hit. So, and then we shut down. So it was a lovely, lovely experience though. And I'm going to let Carol share anything that she wants to share about maybe some things.
I just want to add, when you talked about they didn't share like, and then I did this and then I did that, when it made me think of something I hadn't thought of before, but the difference between autobiography and memoir. When you're writing memoir, you're searching for a slice of your story and the meaning in it. And that's kind of, I guess, what Diane Millis is having you zero in on. And, you know, that particularly with a calling story, you're zeroing in on, you know, how does this give my life meaning? And so that's different than listing your resume or, you know, describing your resume. And then one of the things I think, and I loved everything you said about this, a couple of things I saw that were themes through people's stories were often the place where they experienced grace, like as a child, is often the way that becomes the form in which they extend it. You know, it's kind of like they're called in to do something that was through a forum they received that calling or that grace in the first place. So I thought that was really good. But we kind of, I think people did learn to listen. And so then when we did the small groups and the writing groups, it gave us an expectation and a comfort with doing those kind of conversations. But I definitely think we had to be taught how to do them. And you did a great job of that, of setting that up for us. So that was really good.
Thank you all so much. I think there'll be some questions. I just wanted to underscore something I noticed, which is that you did all of this learning how to do it well and then setting it up. Like a lot of energy went into making the right container for these things to happen. But then magic happened. Like you, suddenly God showed up and everything, like it was just, I don't know how to say it. The word delight just kept coming to me, like this joyful, beautiful thing just happened seemingly on its own, and yet it would not have happened without all this work behind it. So it's just a really, just theologically really interesting.
But thank you for saying that this day, like this very moment, because this morning I have been wrestling with this whole thing of that, because that's also been the fact that I do think it felt like kind of magical has been part of the grief of shutting it down, and then also planning for this next year, because you start to say, we poured all this work into it and forget that there was this grace that helped it along. And yeah, we did what the grant told us to do or what we said we were going to do, but also there was this extra. So I guess this is what I listened to this morning, is that I guess there's going to be this grace that comes when we're tired right now of and where do we go and all of that. So thank you for saying that.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, how people showing up in boxes, their spirits aren't staying in the boxes online, you know what I mean? So yeah, it'd be interesting as we go into this year to see what shows up that's so much bigger than we expected from an online experience or hybrid, however we all end up. So I'm sure there's some questions for Erica and for Carol. Chris?
Yeah, I thank you for that. It was, and for all of you, it was really, both those stories in both settings are really beautiful. I'm trying to figure out how we're going to have vocational conversations over Zoom. And I think we're going to move into it. For the last 5 weeks, we've been engaged in a small group series. And this last week, folks told their autobiographies through the lens of race. And I'm actually wishing, Carol, that I had that distinction that you drew between memoir and autobiography to help everybody as they were preparing for that. Because some people did, I can only speak from the group that I was with, did approach it as a memoir and went to a different place than the folks who just, did their whole autobiography. And I'm just wondering, I think that it's got to be possible over Zoom. It's what we have. So people have become much more comfortable with it. So I'm getting ready to venture into that place. I'm wondering, Erica, if you have written up what it is that you've just said and all the different things that you've shared that you would share with us.
Yeah, I haven't written it up into a report necessarily, but I can type some. I'm happy to answer some of those questions. But I have lesson plans and examples of it. I'm happy to share with people, which might be more helpful.
Yes, that would be really helpful.
And can I suggest something? Because I know your church has had a writing group.
Yes.
Doing the writing ahead of time. We've done, particularly this summer, since the weekend, the initial George Floyd protests weekend, we reconvened a small group of writers and invited everybody to live with the word lament for the weekend, and then show up on a Sunday morning prior to worship and just read. It was like a moth night, except it was just a Zoom call, but people had prepared. And so I wasn't prepared for exactly how effective that would feel, but it gave a space. And it was kind of a holy ground experience. And so the next week we said, well, live with a word that gives you hope. And people would just come and they would get 2 to 3 minutes to read, or they could just show up and listen. But we had a lot of writers show up and read for an hour, and that was good too. And I think that kind of transcended Zoom call-ish stuff, because they had prepared something and thought about it and kind of got to the heart of it. So, and it was a really simple format. I mean, you don't have to have a big lesson plan for, we had one word or one sentence or one writing prompt, and then just let it happen. But I think we might do more of that in the fall.
Oh, I love that. But what a great idea. Our memoir writing group is growing strong, but they meet once a week, but how to figure out how to expand it into to make it an opportunity for the whole congregation and make the prompts more focused, and also the encouragement to keep it short so that several people can share.
I just found this morning. So a friend sent me this, but St. Paul's Cathedral in London. It's just stpaul's.co.uk, an Anglican church. Their adult learning is doing a thing called Hard Questions for Hard Times. And it's really like 6 or 7 questions that they've thrown out, and they've made videos of people providing short answers for those. But like things like, what is church when people can't be together, was one of the questions. And I should have written more of the questions down, but they deal with where is God in COVID-19, and just some very hard questions in hard times. But I looked at that this morning and I thought, there's 6 writing prompts right there. So, that might be helpful.
Great. So St. Paul's Cathedral in the UK?
Yes.
Yeah.
In London.
London.
Thank you, in London. Awesome.
One of the things I heard in that was something that those of us who are involved in teaching are really stressing in using Zoom, which is, what they call the flipped classroom. So having people do a lot of prep before, so then Zoom is for engaging with other people, and Zoom is a hard space to think in, sometimes off the cuff. So giving people like the prompt ahead of time, and then when they come together, what they're really doing is connecting with these other people through what they wrote. I think it's just, you're echoing what other people who are Zoom professionals are saying about how Zoom can be used effectively. You can, I invite more questions now, or you can, let your questions evolve over the course of this. Yeah, Kate.
I just wanted to say I'd really like a copy of Kim's questions. If you can share that with us. I thought there were some creative things in there that were great.
Sure thing.
My guess is Jessie. Yeah, I see Jessie's unmuting. So.
Yeah, please. If you don't mind sending any of these resources, lesson plans, questions that you have, or I'm happy to type up what you said. We're recording this session too, and then we'll post them on the peer learning page of the website so that everyone can access them. These are excellent resources. And
this is also a piece of the purpose behind this whole project, this whole nationwide project, the one that we are a piece of. just learning more about vocation. No one, you are the experimenters, like you're the scientists on the ground who are learning what is happening. And then Jesse and I are filtering a lot of this up so that people can learn like what works here, what's powerful in the work that you're doing, so that more churches can do this. So it's really exciting, and we really appreciate all the creativity and heart that you all are bringing to this. It's amazing. I'm going to be floating all the rest of this week just on this conversation. St. Mark's, I don't know which of you would like to speak about what you have done and what you're planning.
Sure, I can speak briefly. You know, we haven't done anything yet. This is something that interview sermons or something we are looking at for the fall. Just in our own sort of brainstorming, I'm hearing some connections with things that others have done, which is nice. One thing in particular that we were thinking about was that it would be nice to sort of have a pre-interview, an opportunity to have conversation, and then sort of hone things down. Kim, I think you mentioned that you passed your questions on to those people that the youth were going to interview beforehand. In a similar way, we were thinking about having sort of an initial conversation with folks. The preacher sort of walking away from that and sort of honing down to a few questions to focus on, and then doing the formal interview with recording on Skype, kind of like this. Where we've already passed them those questions in advance, so they have time to reflect and answer, in a way that would maybe feel more polished and maybe might make people feel more comfortable if they know you're being recorded and it's going to be in the worship service. Potentially that's a lot of pressure. So we've sort of envisioned that process for us. I guess one of the things that I could use some help is, how do we see potentially drawing the connections between the texts that we would be preaching on and the sermon and the conversation that we bring to the table? We're on a lectionary. I know not everybody necessarily is, but that means we have readings that are already appointed to us. So we were considering, do we stay on the lectionary and hunt down texts that go well with the vocational theme? Or do we, select our own texts for a day or something like that? And while we have given ourselves the flexibility to select, our own texts, maybe in the future, we're trying to stay focused on staying on the lectionary. And I don't know if anybody has any other insights on how to weave an interview story with the stories that are being, brought by Scripture that day. That's maybe one thing that I'm still looking to explore.
Have any of you done that? We've mostly been talking about listening to stories during some kind of adult formation time, so there wasn't that pressure of the lectionary. But did anybody do this? I think there's several people who want to do it.
We did it. Erica. Is Erica?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. Wasn't there a 2 to 3 minute per story reflection with the sermon that focused on the, yeah.
Yes, we've done that before, where we invited whatever that lectionary text you choose to be, the sermon theme or whatever, choosing one word. This is from what we did in Lent. Again, pre-shutdown. We chose one word a week, and with our narrative circles, we just threw out the word serve, and that's the theme. And then we would put the text. We'd do some Lectio Divina, where we invited people to sit comfortably, take a few deep breaths, and read the following scripture as a group, with one person each reading a line slowly and clearly. Pause for a moment between each section. Read through this passage 3 separate times with a longer pause before each rereading. And then they sit in silence for a while, and then you step into the narrative circle prompts, which, you know, you're starting to reflect first on the text and approaching the theme of the questions with that knowledge first. And then the story prompt always, for instance, this is Mark 9, and it was, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. So the word was serve. So the questions we asked for our vocation reflection was, think of a person in your life who you think to be a great servant. What are the things they do? How have their actions impacted you? And so everyone had a chance to tell a 4-minute story on that prompt. And then people reflect on that to that person reflects back.
So that was in a small group setting?
Yes.
Yeah, we broke everyone out into groups of 4 people. So everyone, it's the 4-4-4 model. Within an hour, you're done.
Okay. So
but that was one, I'm sorry, that
not
was
a
one
sermon.
small. Oh.
Yeah, that was just one small group. We had small groups that did other things too.
But they all used that word for the week, and they all had access. People that would just get on the website could have access to those questions, and the questions were written by the preacher that day. So the questions came out of the sermon ahead of time, so it tied in worship with the reflection, like that the other people are doing. So.
I could see though really easily that process of writing some questions that are drawing on themes from scripture. I could see that really easily being done in a homily setting too. You know, you prepare those questions ahead of time and then have a conversation in the way that you're thinking about.
And we encourage people could use those if they weren't in a small group, they could use those like a question each day to journal on, you know, during Lent. So there could be that. It could be solo work too, but.
Well, that's interesting the way you tied, you know, what was happening in the sermon time to like several different ways that people would engage it during the week, whether they did it by themselves or they did it in a small group or whatever. And that might be a way for you all at St. Mark's to think about maximizing your efforts in what you're doing. And I love the idea of finding one word. Like, you're not trying to find a match for an entire narrative. You just pulled a significant word out, and then that word can live in a lot of experiences.
It fit our language school idea. So the series title was called "What Do We Mean When We Say," and then each week was, you know, that. So it was kind of an easy going at the vocabulary thing.
Yeah.
Worked for us.
Do you want to explain the language school? Those of us who haven't pored over all your material the way Betsy and I have might not remember.
We're in just such, I mean, I guess all our cultures are secular now, surrounding, but we feel pretty in a secular culture that even within the church that it's uncomfortable to use religious language. And so sometimes that keeps us from having spiritual conversations or just avoiding them. And that's one of the things when Erica had us, like, people will talk about work all day, but to talk about work in the context of your faith and your calling has been really difficult for people. And so we sort of approached it like, we need to learn how to talk about these things, and we need language that, you know, helps us talk about it. And so that's kind of how the language idea came. And then just sort of research, what do you do in a language school? How do you learn to speak a certain language? And so how does that look in a church? Because Eric and I both moved here from the South. So, you know, we got kind of rolled our eyes sometimes at the religious language in the South, and now we miss it because, like, people, you know, there's not the discomfort with some of the words that we miss. So,
and then our focus on listening for, you know, that first part of the year was kind of the idea of when you immerse yourself in a new culture and a language, you know, first you have to listen. You have to listen to the way the words sound. You have to be good listeners to learn a language. And so that's why we wanted to start that foundation and then building up on the words of some of that core vocabulary.
And I just want to touch on this. One of the things that we value very highly at St. Mark's is good branding, because it means good communication. So I like that, you know, that way of framing it around the language. And I'm just sort of curious if there were any other sort of ideas about how folks had branded this stuff, or any sort of cute phrases that they used to describe what this was, because this is definitely as an interview sermon, it's a little outside of the box for the average layperson out there. So I was just curious if there was any language that folk had to promote or communicate what this was to folks.
That's a good question.
I wanted to say that we actually didn't promote any of this to our congregation to say, this is a language school and we're doing it this way. This was to keep us on theme. I think mostly, at least, you know, we wanted to have a narrative for us as a team to move forward, and an idea that would keep us kind of on track. But I think when we talk about calling on vocation with our congregation, we wanted them not to see this as a project that's out here, but an invitation for us all to organically grow deeper in our faith. So let's tell stories. Let's have a conversation, instead of like, this is the way we're branding it. Would you agree with that, Carol?
I think yeah, sort of. I mean, I think we have a team that knows it's a language school. We're kind of building the layers of it. I think that the idea is that year 2 and 3 will get a little more immersion into this language of learning it. And but we did say we did have a word of the week. So I mean, I think there was that idea that people knew there's a word we're focusing on in worship this week, and you know, it's this. But yeah, we didn't. In fact, we had a lot of conversation about that. Like, even how much do we talk about this grant and those, we had those kind of conversations a little bit, you know, to how do we make this organic and so.
That's a really good kind of segue into the next question, thinking about making this organic to the congregation's life. I want to put our second and third questions together. The second question kind of has to do with, in the arc of how your congregation is developing awareness of vocation, kind of where did this fit and where is it helping you go next? And what are you learning about vocation because you've been listening to these stories? Like, what has surprised you? And you've gotten into some of that, but I'd love to hear more of it. So.
Well, I'm happy to start, Jane.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Great to see everybody today. As Pastor Edwin described, St. Mark's is, we're just getting started and very excited about the opportunity to grow in this area. I think 2 years ago, for us, this started with Collegeville's Lives Explored, and the work that you did in that, and listening to people's stories of vocation and calling, and moving that forward into what we've witnessed in this last year with small groups. We have seen what happens when you move beyond thinking you know somebody because you've attended church 20 years with them, and then you hear their story and you hear them talk about God's call in their life, and that what takes them to that deeper sense. And so it's been watching the Holy Spirit work during these stories, the vulnerability, the trusting that is involved in doing that has been a great experience for St. Mark's. And so we are looking forward to trying to make this happen and learn from those of you that have been doing it.
Thank you. That's such a good way to think about, like, plotting a course along, you know, and growing in what you're doing. And I just love that that thing that's so common that you raised up, like thinking you know somebody because you've been passing the piece to them for 20 years. Like you don't really know that. Like there is an intimacy there. I don't mean to downplay that intimacy because that is for real. But when you find out all these other things, it's like, oh, there's this treasure here I have not opened up in all this time.
Mm.
Thanks. So Kim and Stephen, yeah, what are you thinking about how this how those interviews kind of pushed you along, and yeah, where you were before or where you're going next, what you learned?
I think in Kim, having the members of our congregation who were going to be called by our internship youth, it was a way for them to learn more of the language of call and their place in that call, so that they were not only answering that question for the youth, but answering it for themselves. Yeah. So it was a way for them to do kind of their own work around that. For us, it felt like that first year was about introducing that language. I like that idea of the language school, but introducing the foundation of the vocabulary and what all of this is to to push us into this next year of making the space to be able to hear more of call and more of what God is doing. But
I also think that what was reinforced in hearing other people's stories, for the youth particularly, and then to hear that the idea that there are multiple callings, that we have multiple callings, that was just reinforced over and over again, and was so freeing for high school and college age youth to hear, to be reminded that they don't, that this time in their life doesn't need to be figured out.
Yes.
So that I would, for them to hear that and be reminded of that, and to see then how it played out, just was reinforced, and is a moving forward is just a great reminder to have, to see then, well, what are we called to do and to be right now? Who are we? What's changing? And how is God using us?
What I kept hearing from the youth in their response to their experience was they kept hearing Kim say calling is more about being instead of doing. And I think that was a big epiphany for many of them.
It would be for a lot of people, right? I think it's coming to them at a really fruitful time in their lives. They get to take that knowledge in so early on and now live out of it. It strikes me that a piece of what's so powerful about this is in all these ways in which you're exposing people to the real lived experience of vocation. You're getting around these issues of language. You're not talking about, you're not trying to teach people about vocation. You're putting the real thing in the midst of them and letting them have contact with it and see how it lives. And that's really, really powerful. I see all of you doing that. I wish more of our education could happen like that, where we see the real thing and we get to learn from the real thing and not from somebody just talking about the thing.
Yeah, I know. I like the way you said that too, because throughout the month too, I kept thinking, so what I did is once the pandemic hit, I didn't know how this would work. I really wanted them to do more service projects, and they couldn't. So I just filled our time that we had slotted to meet with Zoom calls and people coming and sitting outside with us. So that
I just love it. Let me just say, I just love that. Like, it wasn't at all what you wanted, and this amazing thing happened.
Right. No, it was so good. And after every time we talked to somebody, I would say, okay, so what did you hear? That was like the reflection part. And I don't know, moving forward, I just like sort of didn't know, like, I wish I would have had, at times I thought I should have had more time where I was just teaching or talking, but then, but what you said, I mean, they experienced it through other people's stories and listening. And so that was the heart of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then just even asking them to reflect back about what they heard, just allowing them to process was fruitful.
Yeah, thank you. In Plymouth, you talked some about your surprises, like things you learned about vocation that were new for you. Anything else you want to?
Sort of following up on Kim's thing of I think what struck me most of the vocation stories Erica did with the artists, it really, several of them, it struck me, here they were doing these art kind of jobs or doing their art work, but really they were this piece of art. I mean, it was like it didn't really matter what they were making. It was like they were being, I mean, something was being shaped in them, and I realize that applies to everybody, no matter what our jobs are or what our careers are. It's you're the masterpiece that
You
so
remind me of that reminds me of a really wonderful story. Like this is a story that happened where I was. So I was in a meditation group that was and a Zen teacher was teaching. So one of the people said, I have never asked the teacher, I've never understood, like, why do Zen monks do bonsai? Because I thought Zen was about kind of going with the flow, and with bonsai, like you're like changing how this plant is, like you're fussing with it and making all these changes to it. And the person answered, how do you know it's not the bonsai that's working on the monk? And I think that's what you're saying about these people and the work that they do, the art they create. Like they're getting creative. Yeah, I really love that. Rachel, do you want to ask something? You've been, I'm so glad that someone showed up who just wanted to ask questions or hear. Or
I've enjoyed, like someone's mowing right outside my window. There's things bubbling. I don't have any specific questions. It's been really interesting to hear what other folks are doing and also how they've pivoted some of that in the pandemic. So thanks.
Yeah, it's so good to hear. Any last things that you all want to add? Or anything about where you're going next that we wouldn't guess?
One thing I've thought about, because you all were having these conversations around, interviews or community service, or the other thing is, I thought maybe the next place this goes after people have told their vocation stories are the discovery, like the, I don't know, the spiritual gifts or practices, like maybe gathering some people who have similar discoveries as they, pursue their vocation, and maybe talking about that, like letting a panel be, of several people that have some of those discoveries in common, and telling the story of those, like zooming in on that. Mm-hmm. That might be helpful even to people who are just starting faith, or just curious, or that might be like the next layer of story to tell, like, so.
Yeah, thank
you. Clearly we have not written our proposal yet. That is due September 1st.
So it's brewing. It's writing itself. Yeah. Like that. I think sometimes when time is passing, like some part of you, like it's getting written inside of you, and when you come to do it, it will be all there. maybe these conversations will help you get there.
That really is a thing. They did some brain research. Someone did some brain research. And if you just kind of stick something there in the back, you know, and you get stuck there, and but it's still there lurking in the back burner, that you'll just walk along and suddenly it will come to the front and it will all be clear.
Yes.
So it will be there.
Or you worry about it, go to sleep and wake up. That's the answer.
That's how project proposals get written.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unknowns for our congregation right now with the transition in the city in general. And also with being so dispersed. I mean, we are kind of meeting in person, but we're mostly online for worship still. You know, we have 8 people on a Sunday morning as opposed to 250. And so I think our questions are going to be different, but I think, you know, again, with the theme of the language school, you know, but the words are kind of the same. Like some of those core words are the same, but they're just going to be translated a little different or applied a little bit differently. We're doing a lot of conversations on racial justice right now. And we were before, but now it's more like, what's our calling in this right now at this moment? Same thing with conversations surrounding how do we do church and how do we stay connected without seeing one another in community. And so there's a lot, the question marks, at least for me, seem so much bigger than the joy and perfection of last year. Last year was wonderful. This year's like, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's a serious year, but I think in the doing of it, surely we'll find those same kinds of surprises. And we did, for all of you who are thinking about doing something with racial justice, we did post a document with some questions that might help a congregation discern a calling and kind of the shape of the calling for them, because it can feel overwhelming. Like you just don't know what piece to pick up. So it was intended to help you kind of find your way into what piece of this bigger project is yours. Thank you all so much. This is more fun than a barrel full of monkeys for me. So I'm really, really thankful for being with you all and hearing about this. Jesse, are there any announcements that you want to make? Anything you want to be sure?
Just that we'll get this recording up in the next day or two on the website. So that'll be available. And then as these resources, these great questions and lesson plans and things come in, I'll post those online as well. And then I think this conversation is going to lead so nicely into our last peer learning group of the summer, at least next week, Tuesday. So not Wednesday, but Tuesday at 1 o'clock Central Time, where we'll talk more about worship. So again, thank you for joining us. It's really a treat to be with you all, and we'll see some of you next week.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Peace be with you.
Also with you.